pretty much all of you. How many of you feel like you could define sustainability? Not one. Maybe a few. Does anyone want to kind of just shout out some ideas of what they think sustainability means? And no one's getting graded on this. Yep.
Like protecting the planet for future generations.
Yes. Yep. Protecting the planet for future generations. That's a good one. Anyone else? We all agree. That sounds like a good definition. We're okay with that. All right, cool. So today I'm going to share what I think sustainability really stands for and what it was originally intended to mean before it became kind of a commercialized idea. Not that all of the commercial ideas are wrong around it. So since we're an academic institution, we should probably start with a definition, right? It's only appropriate. They'll get a little more fun after that. So this is one of the original definitions of sustainable development. I believe in 1987 is when this report was originally published. And that is development that meets the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So I want to pull out two words in this that I think are really important and will help our discussion as we move forward. The first is this idea of a need. Can anyone maybe give me an example of what you think a need is? What do we need? Water. Okay. Food. Yep. That's good, especially donuts. Transportation, right, to get to one place or another. Okay, great. Medicine. Yes. Healthcare. Shelter. Yeah, it's nice, especially when it gets cold out in January. So those are all really good. Those are really good examples of needs. I would probably add air to that one. It's also pretty important. But there's also some other things that we might think are needs, right? We mentioned transportation. That leads itself into forms of technology that we use every day that a lot of us think we need. And in some instances, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think they have given us a lot. But we have to think about extrapolating that forward, right? If we have all these things now as a need, what will future needs look like, and how will that impact our ability to live on this planet and also for others to live? And so that brings me to the second word of the day, generations, aka people. So a lot of times when I talk with folks about sustainability, I can see it in their eyes. They see the polar bear. The polar bear, it's lonely, it's on the ice sheet, and it's floating away, and it's sad, right? It's a lonely polar bear. Or we see the last tree in the forest that hasn't been cut down yet. Or you might see a recycling bin, right? These are images that we think of when we think of sustainability. But most of the time, the image isn't a person's face smiling. Or people, or community. Sustainability, our goal is to make sure that people can live on the planet and be happy, healthy, and prosperous and meet all of their needs, whatever we define needs to be. Right, so that's going to hopefully frame our discussion. The other definition, just because it's short and I think it allows for a lot of creative thinking, is the definition that if any of you are in the sustainable engineering program, have seen many, many times before, this is the definition they use as the basis for their program, is enough for all, forever. So enough goes back to the idea of what is a need, what is enough to live, to be happy, to be prosperous. And then for all. When we think about generations and we think about people, we need to include everybody in that discussion, not just our friends and our neighbors and our family. And then forever, which I feel like is more of a philosophical discussion and something a little deeper than what we can have today. But how far into the future can we plan for? What are we thinking about? Are we planning for our grandchildren or our great-great-grandchildren, great-great-great, et cetera, et cetera? Right, so we have to keep that in the back of our mind. So this, to me, is a good starting point for what sustainability is, but I want to kind of dive into some of the areas that I think we're not doing super well on in two ways. One, the sustainability folks haven't necessarily embraced this issue as one of their own, and two, it continues to be a problem in our society and other societies around the world, and that is environmental justice, or in many cases, environmental injustice. And so the idea of environmental justice is that we have an equal share of environmental amenities and burdens. Can anyone maybe think of what an environmental amenity would be? I'll give you a hint. You mentioned a few of them already. Yes, clean water. Yes, the environment provides us water to drink. With that, does anyone else have any ideas while I drink my clean water? Stumped you. This is exciting. I'm only on slide 3. Okay, so here are some examples of environmental amenities, and this is definitely not an inclusive list. But clean air and water are probably a top among them, right? The environment provides us with air and water and food and shelter. It provides us with flood protection. Down here in the bottom right is a wetlands. This helps us protect against flooding in coastal areas. We have pollinators, right? Without bees, we would not have a food system. We would not have much of what we get at our grocery store. And as many of you may know, bees are now, a few bee species are now on the endangered species list, right? So this is a problem that we're facing today. Carbon sequestration. I'm sure all of you have heard about carbon emissions. The Earth actually naturally absorbs carbon emissions, right? The trees absorb it. We've heard of trees absorbing a lot of carbon emissions, but also the ocean is the biggest carbon sink on the planet. That absorbs the majority of the carbon emissions that are naturally put off by the environment and are artificially released into the atmosphere. Medicine, someone mentioned earlier, the environment gives us a lot of the modern-day medicines that we have today. Building materials, wood, metal, plastics, and of course, fuel, right? Energy sources of all forms. So we call these things ecosystem services. These are services that the environment provides for us that we would otherwise have to pay to get, whether and invent technology to provide supplements for that. And we've seen that already. We already have to supplement the ecosystem services. We pay for filtered water, right? We can't just, some of us can maybe go to a stream and put in a bottle or a glass of water and drink right out of it, but most of us probably wouldn't do that, and you shouldn't. For like the Schuylkill in Delaware, please don't do that. It'd be very bad. So we have to filter it, right? We have to supplement what the ecosystem already does for us. We put up levees and berms to prevent against flooding in areas that either are underwater because of rising sea levels or were underwater when we originally put homes there. And then carbon sequestration is just another example of areas where we've actually artificially started to sequester carbon into the ground and the ocean. Okay, so these are examples of environmental amenities, the things that the environment provides for us that are good, that allow us to live prosperously. Now we're going to talk about environmental burdens. What are maybe some environmental burdens that we can think of?
Natural disasters.
Okay, yep, natural disasters.
Pollution.
Pollution. Yes, depleting the ozone. It's a good one. So I'm going to focus on the pollution side of things, but the storm and our ozone are very good examples as well. These are ways in which we have taken advantage of environmental resources and made human burdens on the environment. So up here is what it looks like from the air of fracking sites. If anyone has ever seen these before, you'll recognize them. It doesn't actually look that bad from the air, right? It just looks like a couple extra roads. What you don't see underground is, of course, the groundwater pollution, as well as the large areas of wastewater that's left out and it's either many times it leaks or overflows causing more environmental damage. The most shocking one to me always is what tar sand extraction looks like. That's an example of Alberta, Canada, where they have a lot of tar sand production. They basically just dig up the whole earth, they heat it up, melt out the oil, and they leave behind massive environmental damage as a result that pollutes the groundwater as well. Landfills. How many of you have been to a landfill before? It's kind of a common school trip to do, right? Landfills take all of our trash to make it go away, right? But it doesn't go away. It eventually leaches through the ground. And then lastly, this is a power plant, and that produces obviously harmful emissions as well as potentially contaminating the groundwater. So this is an environmental burden because the people that live around here or rely on the resources around here are impacted by this potentially positive that other people get out of what we're doing to the environment, right? We get fuels to heat our homes, we get a place to take our trash when we don't want it anymore, and we get energy to power our lights. So when we think about environmental justice, environmental burdens. So when we think about environmental justice, we don't see an equal share of environmental amenities and burdens. The NAACP states that race is the #1 indicator of placement of toxic facilities in this country. And this is examples of here in America, but there are plenty more around the world. The EPA has tried to respond to this problem. Right? We recognize that this is a problem. The statistics don't lie. Numbers supposedly don't lie. And so the EPA put together the EJ 2014 Act that works to try to comprehensively incorporate environmental justice into the agency's programs, policies, and activities. Which sounds good, right? Sounds like we're recognizing the situation. The problem is states are the ones that actually implement policies and regulations that the EPA puts out, right? They write the permits, they perform the compliance checks, and they write penalties. So if the state doesn't deem it to be a problem, the EPA doesn't really have a whole lot of power to stop that. And there's a really good example that recently happened here in the United States. Can anyone think of? You are awesome. Flint, Michigan. Yes. Flint, Michigan. Who has heard of Flint before? Okay, awesome. Does anyone want to give me a little synopsis of what happened in Flint? I can tell you, but I'm sure you'd rather listen to your fellow classmates a little bit. Yeah. I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit? Yes. What specific toxin? Lead. Yep. Okay, great. So Flint, the water management was switched over to the state. The state decided to save money that they would switch water supplies from Detroit's water to the Flint River without really adequately assessing what types of treatment they would need to do to the water to make sure that it didn't corrode the pipes and pollute the citizens. And unfortunately, for basically a year, it went completely unrecognized by the state, and children and residents of Flint were poisoned with lead in their water. This is actually what their water looked like, and they were told it was fine and that they could drink it. They were eventually told that they shouldn't drink it, but for a while they were told that it was fine. And they still can't drink it. This happened in 2014. They're still not able to drink their water. They're not able to shower in their water. Right, can you imagine living for 3 years not being able to shower? They do, right? Because eventually you break down. You're like, I can't draw a bath every night. It's impossible. And it's expensive. Right? Bottled water is really expensive. And even though for a while there, a lot of it was being donated, those donations dry up when the media starts to move on to the next story. And they can't move, right? You can't sell a house with water that's poisonous. So this is a real problem that these the citizens are still living with. They're fixing, they're working on fixing the problem. The water testing has shown much lower levels of lead to the point where it's safe to drink. The problem is they're still changing out the pipes. And when they change out a pipe, it makes a spike in the lead levels, so they still tell them not to drink the water. That process will probably take another 2 years to finish the pipe fitting. So this is crazy to me, that this happened in America to our citizens. And a big reason why this happened is because citizens in this area, and the next example I'm going to give you, have limited access to resources. And we're going to talk about what those resources are and why it limits their ability to fight against these environmental injustices. How many of you have heard of Mossville, Louisiana? I hadn't either. I was doing some research for this presentation. I thought it was a good example. Similar situation. This community had a large number of manufacturing and production facilities. They had a vinyl plastic manufacturing plant, a coal-fired plant, an oil refinery, and many chemical producing manufacturers that produced 4 million pounds of carcinogenic toxic chemicals that eventually leached into the water, air, and land. Water, air, yeah. The health impacts, as you can imagine, have been stark. People have died from cancer. Many children are cursed with asthma for the rest of their life. And as this sign makes it very clear, there's no way you can leave. Right? They don't have the funds to just move if they can't sell their home. Right? So they're stuck here in this toxic wasteland, essentially. So both of these examples point out that there is a stark injustice in what is happening to some communities based off of their ability to access different types of power and resources. When you lack access to power, to protection, to political institutions, you tend to be trapped in this cycle of nobody's listening to me and they all think I'm crazy. If you know someone who knows someone, right? How many times have you maybe gotten out of a situation because you knew someone or a friend knows someone that could help you out, right? It happens. It's not a bad thing. That's how life works. But if you don't have that connection, it makes it a lot harder to get through the system. You can't jump a few fences along the way. If the justice system isn't correctly prosecuting those who are responsible. Luckily in Flint, they are now prosecuting those who are responsible, but had it not become a media storm, that might not have happened. Access to research and scientific data. I think this is something we probably take for granted because we are in a place of higher education where there's labs, any building that you walk into, right? You can test water. Residents of Pennsylvania who are noticing that their water is catching on fire don't necessarily have the access to test it to make sure that it's safe to drink, even though they're told it's safe to drink. Flint residents didn't have access to scientists to test their water, even though it was clearly not safe to drink. Eventually they got that access to that resource, but without that, it's just a person yelling in a room to people who can claim otherwise. Media attention. I think sometimes we underestimate the power of the media, or maybe we don't. Maybe we recognize that it has a lot of power now. But if you can get a media attention, it helps your cause a lot more. But if you're just a small little town in Louisiana, it's got to be a lot harder to get media attention to your cause. And then financial security, right? We've talked about that already. But being able to fix the problem by paying your way up or paying your way out. So for me, so we talked about environmental burdens, right? And those all made sense. I think they're all very clear examples. We've maybe seen them in our neighborhoods or in other neighborhoods. One of the big environmental burdens in my mind, though, and the one that I'm most focused on, is climate change. Has anyone heard of climate change? Yeah, okay, a few people. I'm nodding to make sure that you're still awake, which is good. Okay, so climate change. It's going to get hotter, it's going to get wetter, it's going to get drier, depending on where you live. You're going to see a lot more flooding, which will result in the spread of waterborne diseases, especially those who can't get out of the way. We've seen this in many areas around the country and the world already. Drought and water shortages will lead to food insecurities, especially those who, again, can't buy foreign goods or get foreign goods brought to them. And you may actually lose your home because the water levels are rising and eventually becomes the ocean. These are all massive environmental burdens that are caused to climate change. The United Nations has said that people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, and institutionally or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change. And if anyone who's read the Pope's encyclical knows that that's basically what the Pope's encyclical is that there are undue environmental burdens on others due to the actions of some. So I would like to make a statement today, maybe controversial, but I'm pretty sure climate change is racist, sexist, and classist. It is disproportionately affecting people who are marginalized. Women in developing countries that have to walk to get water are now having to walk further to get water, which means their young daughters have to leave school earlier to help out around the house to make up for the amount of time that they're spending getting water. When storms hit, people who don't have funds can't move out, can't rebuild. In Hurricane Sandy, we saw, at least in my opinion, racial injustice done to the African American communities in those neighborhoods, in part due to decades of poverty, segregation, deep disenfranchisement. Poor and working class blacks were disproportionately affected by Hurricane Sandy. And if you ask them, they would agree. They say that if they were white and a wealthier city, that they would have been protected better by the government. And just to point out the power of the media, I found this doing research, and I was totally blown away by these two posts of two different groups of people wading through water after the storm had hit. They both found some food for presumably themselves and their family and friends that they were sheltering with. One was labeled looter, and the other one was said that they found resources for the ones that they love. They both did the exact same thing because they needed to. No one should judge them for anyone for doing that, and should judge them unfairly. So, what are some of the things that cause environmental injustices? One, culturally seated social injustices and inequalities that we see even today have not been resolved, even though sometimes we think that they're resolved. They're just out of sight, out of mind. Just like a landfill is out of sight, out of mind, it doesn't mean your trash is gone. It just means someone else's problem. Corporate greed, and I want to clarify that not all companies are bad. I think there's this stigma that companies are horrible, greedy institutions, and there are definitely examples of those, but there's also really good examples of companies that are really, really trying to do good and provide a positive outcome as part of their operations. So I don't think it's fair to lump all of them together into this one category, but there is a lot of examples of where these situations arise because corporations push through regulations and maybe skimp the line a little bit to get what they want. Lack of exposure and appreciation to nature. How many of you in the last year have taken a trip, like a family trip or whatever, a trip to a national park? Okay, good. Well, that's great. You all probably have a much better appreciation for nature. One, because maybe you've grown up with that appreciation. You lived in families that appreciated it, or you understood later in life. But not everyone has the ability to go into nature that way, right? If you live in a city, it's really hard for you to expose nature or experience nature in that way. I have a friend who works for a nonprofit in Philadelphia that helps first-generation students get into college, and they bring them up to this area. I believe they go to Bryn Mawr for like a 3-day kind of immersion experience. And it's very common for her to hear from her students, they're like, oh, the air smells so clean out here. Like they've never left Philadelphia. They've never experienced anything different. And probably they live right next to our oil refinery, which has the most polluted air in the city. So they've just never experienced anything different. And so if you don't experience that, you have no idea what you're missing and why it's important. We tend to focus on short-term results, right? We want that short-term win. I feel like it's perpetuated more with technology, right? We can instantly contact someone. We can instantly find the answer to something. Like trivia is impossible to do now because you can just look up on your phone, right? It's not fair. And I'm not saying that's bad, right? It's good to have access to information. This is where I think there's that, like, the middle ground. But as a result, we tend to not think long-term about the decisions that we make or the situations that are in existence and how that might unfold down the line. So, in my opinion, a sustainable world is not possible without social justice. If we are continually marginalizing and disenfranchising large swaths of our population, there's no way that we can have that world where future generations are able to meet their own needs, because there are current generations that can't meet their own needs. Okay. So I always like to end my presentations with ideas of what you can do. I feel like hearing someone blabber on about their opinions, and these are definitely, in part my opinions. I did do some research on this, but it's also brought up by my feelings about what I see around me. So these are some things that I would just encourage you to think about doing in your day-to-day life. First of all, try to fight against stereotypes. It's sometimes hard to know what a stereotype is. If you've grown up with it your whole life, you don't maybe recognize it as a stereotype. But try to be cognizant. I work on this all the time. And there are times where I get caught in the situation where I'm like, oh, right, that is definitely a stereotype that I have that I didn't realize I had. And now I recognize it. Now I'm going to try to work against undoing that stereotype. Take time to get to know people who are different than you. Say hi. Chat it up. You're sitting on a plane next to somebody new, ask them their name. Learn their story. You're going to learn something. It's a great opportunity to start to understand how these situations pile onto each other. Try to look at decisions and situations from the point of view of someone else. This is helpful if you've done the first two, right? If you start to see these differences and the breakage in the social system, you can start to see how other people might experience these issues. But easy things you could do is, what if I didn't have money to get myself out of this situation? Or access to any sort of funds, a loan, even to get myself out of the situation? What if I had no access to information? I had to go to the library if I wanted to do any research on the internet. And what if I felt like an outsider at all times and I didn't feel part of the larger community? How would I see this situation and approach this problem differently? And have open conversations with all so we can help better understand each other. And I think these all kind of build on each other, but just trying to be open and honest can sometimes be a helpful way to start those conversations. So I'd like to end. This is a picture from the People's Climate March. A couple years ago, there's one coming up at the end of April in D.C. But I like this poster because I think a lot of people think that the People's Climate March was about like big posters of the earth or oil or something. But this one's really great. To change everything, it takes everyone. And so for me, sustainability does really mean that we're going to have to change a lot. But we're not going to have to change what we feel for each other and the caring that we feel for mankind. And so to get to a sustainable world, we are going to need everyone's support. And apparently my presentation was only half an hour long. So does anyone have any questions? Just like a new concept to anyone? Like totally just brushing over stuff that you already know? Yep.
This is kind of like a personal question.
Yeah.
But what brought you to like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just repeat it so everyone can hear what brought me to this career. When I went to undergrad, I was one of those freshmen that came in. I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to study, which I'm sure is like a parent's worst nightmare. But I had no idea. All I knew is that I wanted to help people, and I was obsessed with food, and I still am, hence the donut comment earlier. And so I thought I was going to do something with food, and then as I took some classes on the food system, and I was able to take anthropology classes, which first I had to learn what anthropology was. It's not something that was taught in high school. I started to discover that there's this bigger issue around sustainability, and that it was a broad concept, that it had something to do with climate change, but it also had a lot to do with helping others, and I liked that aspect of it. And I also like how broad it is, because I'm I can't focus on one thing for too long, so I like to ping pong all around. So sustainability is great because I can focus on lots of different areas with the common goal of pushing humanity forward. So that's kind of how I got there. Yeah.
What sort of things is Villanova doing to help with all the waste and stuff we create here?
Yes, that's a great question. And that's a whole other presentation, so I'm going to just give you a high-level view of what we're doing. We're definitely working on sustainable operations. We've signed a carbon commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. We recycle a lot of different waste streams here on campus. We have, I think, a 37% recycling or diversion rate from the waste stream. And our trash does go to an incinerator, which produces electricity out of burning the trash, which also has environmental damages by doing that. But as a whole, from a carbon point of view, it is better than a landfill. We do LEED building design for our buildings. There's lots of things we do operationally. But one of the other big things that we try to do is educate students, which sounds really weird for higher education institution to focus on educating its students. But that's, to me, it'd be great to be zero waste and carbon neutral, and I think we should. But if every student that graduates here doesn't understand how sustainability relates to them and why it's important, I feel like we fail. So that, to me, is our biggest cause, is to make sure that you can go out in the world and explain to folks why it's important and why it does relate to business and accounting and healthcare and engineering and philosophy and whatever else you're studying. It does have some impact on what you're studying. There's another question? Yeah.
What do you think the biggest sustainability issue is right now, either in terms of climate change or access to resources or global population? What do you think is the biggest issue?
Oh my God. If you'd asked me a week ago, I'd probably have a different answer. I think it's like asking someone to name their favorite movie or their favorite food. It's almost impossible. So I'm going to give you a couple, if that's okay. So I'd say climate change is probably one of the biggest ones, which sounds super cliche, like, oh, it's climate change. But it is, because it's so big, and we definitely are going to have a hard time living on this planet if we keep going. And because climate change is the visual results of deep-seated problems like the ones we just talked about, right? I feel like if you try to fix climate change, you are also inherently fixing a lot of these other systematic problems. So I think that's probably one of the biggest ones. And then, unfortunately, especially in this country, just awareness is something that we still are trying to work for. The polls are positive. I think it's 66 or 67% of Americans believe climate change is real, which is woohoo! It only took us 10 years. Whereas other countries, they're yeah, guys, where have you been? So that's still a problem, and I'm hopeful that doesn't change. We'll see what happens as we move forward. But as one person put it to me, is like, imagine what we could have done in those 10 years had we not spent those 10 years trying to convince people it was real. So I think if we could just get over that hurdle, we could solve a lot more problems like this. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for things like environmental justice initiatives or
Yes. So the Peace and Justice Office is amazing. I'm sure most of you already know that. And they have put together a resource on how to do some justice work, advocacy work throughout the semester. There's like one for like at least every week, if not every day of the semester. And this is, I have a few copies I'll put down here so you can grab before you leave, but it's also on the Peace and Justice website. Specifically for the environment, there's going to be a number of potential opportunities to do advocacy work and or advocacy training. I think I am not an expert in advocacy. I'm still learning. And so we're going to do some of that. But then for Earth Day, specifically the Friday of Earth Week, we're going to have an advocacy day where we're going to meet with some of our representatives and write letters and that sort of thing. So, and there's another People's Climate March happening January 29th, and we're going to have buses. I will find buses. Apparently everyone gets married on April 29th. So it's hard to find buses because they have all reserved them. But we will find a bus or two, and we will go down. So that's also another opportunity to get involved. Great question. Yeah.
Like we talked about at the beginning, how sustainability is like preserving resources for future generations, while also making sure that current generations have like as much as they need. Then like we talked about all the different ways that like current generations don't have, you know, the amount of resources. So where does the balance and like what should be the focus of like, sustainability? Is it like on people who don't have things now or on the future?
That's a great question. I mean, I think if you focus, I think they're tied. Like, I think they're one and the same, right? If we're already depleting resources now, then we have no hope for the future. So we should probably focus on now, and that will, but with the mindset of what we're going to need for the future. And a lot of it is just changing how we manage these resources. There's something called Cradle to Cradle. Has anyone heard of Cradle to Cradle before? That's a TED Talk. You can look it up. It's also a book, but you're more likely to watch the TED Talk, I'm fairly certain. So the idea is that everything comes from the environment, and everything should go back into the environment the way it came out. And so if we design things that can be deconstructed to be remade efficiently into something else, a lot of times when you recycle, you degrade the resource as you recycle it. So paper, right, newspaper is like been recycled a couple of times by the time it gets to newspaper form, right? The fibers just kind of start to get a little tired of being broken down and put back together. That's my super scientific way of explaining paper recycling, by the way. I'm not a scientist. So the idea with Cradle to Cradle is that you design products so that they can easily be remade, taken apart and remade into other things. We use a ton of resources, and we throw away a ton of those resources. Cell phones are probably the easiest example of this. There are so many precious metals and resources that are really, really limited on this planet that are contained in our phones, and every time we throw them away or they're not recycled properly, we lose that resource. So I am not telling you need to get rid of your phone, you need to get rid of your car. Like, I feel like sustainability people have to live in like paper boxes on the street or something to like really be sustainable. But I don't prescribe to that thought process. I think that we can live in a modern society. We just have to do it a little smarter and update some of our systems, which requires people to get along and do partnerships, which tends to be the problem. Hiccup. Cool. Well, it is 12:11. And I am happy to stay here and answer any more questions. If you want to come up, that's fine too. If you would like to receive email, I do a monthly newsletter on sustainability initiatives on campus, off campus, job opportunities, internship opportunities, etc. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can just write your name up here, and I would be happy to send it to you. It's only once a month. I Do not bombard you with emails. I know, like, I get super nervous when I get some of my emails, like my social security number. Like, please don't spam me. I'll try not to spam you. It's just one email. Thank you so much for coming out. Have a good rest of your week.